Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. Thank you for listening in again to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and I am joined by knife maker Craig Brosman. Craig and I met through the Knife Makers Guild, and I've been following his work for a while now, and I thought it would be a great idea to have him on the show and talk a little bit about some of these knife shows that he's been to and his international experience, and then talk about his induction as a voting member into the Guild, and just talk a little bit about him. So, Craig, thanks very much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. So, kind of customary for the show is to ask you a little bit about yourself outside of knives, and then we can kind of get into what everybody else is interested in from a, knife and knife history and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So you just want to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about, yourself outside of knives.
Yeah. So my name's Craig Brosman. I'm from Northern Indiana. So I live about 45 minutes away from Notre Dame University. I've lived in Indiana my whole life. I'm a big baseball fan. My favorite team is the Cubs. My favorite player, though, it was a Texas Ranger, Nolan Ryan. Love basketball, football, all that stuff. But, in my free time, that's not what I do. I spend time in my garage.
So I know that you have a full-time job. What exactly is what do you do for a full-time job?
Yeah, so my full-time job is I'm a data analyst for the orthopedic section of Johnson & Johnson. My job is to look over sales data and make sure that we're converting the actual sales that we've had into bills. So it's very tedious, and I spend a lot of time doing it. But I do really enjoy data analytics and working by myself quite a bit, and it affords me the opportunity to buy machines for my garage and spend a lot more time with my family.
That's cool. So what got you into knives and knife making? I mean, has it been a part of your life from early on, or talk about that journey?
Sure. Growing up, I spent a lot of time in sports, but my dad was kind of always into trapping and hunting, and he had built his own knife at work. He built a couple knives. One of them was for skinning animals in the garage, and he made a Bowie knife out of some tool steel. So that was kind of cool, seeing him, having him bring that kind of stuff home. And then when I was like 15 or 16, I went and visited some friends of ours, and they showed me how they made knives out of files. That was also really cool. And then, I went through high school. My main job in high school, I was on the newspaper, so that actually ended up being my full-time job out of college, was I was a newspaper reporter. And then I got into models, 40K. So I painted a lot, but then that just consumed a lot of my time and a lot of my money, which is kind of funny because my new hobby consumes way more time and money than my old one. But I sold all my models and all my paints and everything, and I told my wife that I was going to use my bonus from work to buy a forge and anvil and start making knives, because I thought it'd be cool to do something with my hands and start putting together the pictures and the ideas that I had in my mind. I've always had this ability to look at something and just figure out how it works and create it myself. And that kind of gave me knife making gave me that opportunity. After a year or so of doing that, I had met some friends in a nearby city. We hung out quite a bit, and I met John Shore. He's been making knives since the early 80s. He told me, he's like, hey, if you want to learn how to grind and you want to learn how to make knives, if you can get down to Florida, I will teach you everything I know. And I said, that seems like a pretty good deal. So when my family went down to Florida the next February, they went for my niece's Make-A-Wish. And they were all doing like Disney and Universal and stuff. And I rented a car and drove to John's house for 5 days. And he taught me how to grind. He taught me knife design. He taught me handle ergonomics. That's where I really changed my whole idea of what a knife is. My whole philosophy on knife making instantly changed after that. It was no longer making a knife for it to look cool. It was making a knife for it to be functional, making a knife for it to be quality, using only the best materials possible. That's really the turning point in my knife making journey, was going to John's house.
Yeah, and from a pedagogy or a technique perspective, John actually has a pretty unique way of grinding and finishing out blades and things like that. And I mean, you could definitely see that inside of your work. I would say, because I know that Eddie Ray also is studied under John.
Yes. And it's very, very obvious when you see it, if you know John.
Yeah. I mean, but one thing that I admire about that style of finishing is the finish itself. When you're using the soft contact wheels and everything, it looks very smooth and homogeneous, right? Like everything is flat where it's supposed to be flat. Everything is curved and sumptuous where it needs to be sumptuous, and everything looks like it fits proportionally. So I mean, I've always appreciated his style of knife making.
Yeah, and I think what I appreciate about John the most is that he's brutally honest. He will never tell you a lie.
Yeah.
So if you ask him what he really thinks, he might tell you it's dog crap. And then that you need to redo it. And he might also say good job. So he's really honestly going to give you the most honest feedback, and that's how I grew the fastest, was hearing, yes, that's correct how I do it. Not necessarily that's correct, that's the only way to do it. It was that's if you want to make knives like I do, then that's correct how I do it. And constantly, learning one thing and then doing it several times, getting it right, and then moving on to another little thing, and then moving on to another little step. And by the time you know it, you've learned how to grind, you've learned how to do your flats, you've learned how to slot a guard, you learned how to fit a guard, you've learned how to taper a tang, you've learned how to fit the handle to the taper tang. You've also learned how to finish the handle, and you just kind of put it all together and it becomes something beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, Mitchell Hall also studied with John for a little while too, right?
Yeah. I don't think his name's Mitch though. From there, Marshall Hall.
Yeah. Sorry. I was looking it up because I was like, no, it's not Mitch. It's Marshall Hall. Yeah. Marshall.
Marshall Hall. Yeah, he lives maybe 15 minutes from John's house. So I would go to Marshall's house in the morning. Marshall would show me what he was doing, and then I would go to John's house in the afternoon.
Yeah. And one thing that's actually interesting about Marshall's work is that I think that he's taken a lot of the same elements of how to construct a knife, like going through the grinding and flats and everything, but then made it very much his own expression of things. So it's interesting how his style has diverged from John's quite substantially, but it's still, you can still see those facets of that technique and everything come through.
Yeah, his grinding is actually incredibly difficult. So with a typical swoop grind, or how do I explain it? Where it kind of comes up and you get a radius on the top.
Mm-hmm.
You have to move quickly across the blade, so you don't spend a whole lot of time at the ricasso. where you normally would have your blade start, right? Uh, so you end up having like a quarter inch or a little under a quarter inch of like it kind of like a mountain, right? It just kind of comes up like this, and then you have that point where you can start sharpening. Marshall's though is different. Marshall's literally comes in and it starts immediately. He rolls his hand while he's grinding, so he puts his pressure isn't constant. He only puts pressure where he wants to grind. So he'll grind the sharp side of the bevel, and then he'll roll it into the swoop at the top, only grinding what he needs to grind. It's incredibly difficult. I tried it a couple times, and I could do it with my right hand, but every time I went to do it with my left, I could never get it to match.
Yeah. Well, and so that style, the style of grinding that Marshall does is a very versatile. If you can muscle memory it, it's very beneficial because there's lots of things like if you look at the grinding style of like Buster Wawrinski or some of these like
Yep.
I guess fantasy style knives where you have a lot of compounded bevels and things. In order to be able to do that, you have to have a lot of facility around compounding bevels, right? And in order to do that, you have to be able to finesse it and swoop in where you need to go. And the only way to do that, obviously, is by freehand grinding. But in addition with that, understanding that you're basically using a small contact wheel to scoop out material versus it being on a single plane. So it's actually really difficult because your mind has to figure out geometrically how everything is supposed to work and then stock remove all that stuff out. So.
Yeah, it was incredibly hard, and then that's when I realized what he gets $1,200 for, or whatever it is for a three finger EDC or whatever, because there are very few people in the world right now that can grind like he does.
Yeah. Well, kind of on that note, what's your favorite style? Because I see this amalgam of like John Shore and you've done Loveless style blade work,
Yeah.
kind of. But what in your mind's eye, what is your favorite style, and kind of how are you pushing the envelope in your own way to achieve that?
Sure. So my favorite, like this last weekend when I was in Solingen, I saw a maker that was making something that was so simple, but like literally one of the most beautiful knives I've ever seen. And I'd never heard of him before, but his name is Reinhard Tschager, Tschager. And he was making like very clean double grinds with like kind of like an Art Deco look with gold inlays and Damascus inlays on like stainless, and that was kind of an eye-opening thing for me to see. That kind of changed, excuse me, how I looked at things, right? And other things that have really changed how I looked at stuff is like Aron Lake. The simplicity, like the beauty and simplicity is kind of where I want to go. Like keeping things very simple, but yet clean and elegant is kind of where I want to move. The next thing for me educationally is going to Rick Genovese's house to learn how to make inner frame lockback folders. I think that's something that really grabs my eye. Is just the simplicity of just two 4/16 slabs that you've milled out some sort of cavity, and then you've created a lockback around it, and then you use whatever you want for an inlay. But it's like a very simple design. But as we know, simple designs are not always the easiest to execute because there's nowhere to hide. I think that's where I want to move to, is just more simple designs that really grab your eye, and you can just say, wow, I've never seen something like that before. I think that starts with my grinding, because it's definitely a little different than a lot of makers. And and then I find it a lot easier to be inspired in folding knives. So I think it's very difficult for me to look at fixed blades and say and just draw and make something that looks like nobody's ever made that, right? I cannot do that with fixed blades, but I can do my own style of folder. Like I can sit there for hours and draw folding blades. I don't know what it is about folding knives, but I just am more inspired by that. And I think that's more where I'm going to move into is lockback folders and inner frame lockback folders.
Yeah, I think that's cool. And yeah, I agree. Like simple is not easy because I'll tell you, like observationally, when you're looking at simple knives, the adage a place for everything and everything has its place, like the organizational kind of mindset is true of simplistic knives, right? Because everything just looks like it is where it should be, right? But one thing that I've noticed about makers that can achieve this is that they also have to be good machinists as well, and everything has to be square and everything has to be true. Otherwise, you don't have the ability to portray your work as simplistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, kind of on that note, like you've actually had some pretty interesting mentors that you've worked with, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about your experiences with them individually, and kind of like
Sure.
what your takeaways were, because some of them are a little bit old school, and some of them are in like the art knife type of world and everything, and you kind of touch a bunch of different bases with like how you're accumulating knowledge through makers and that transfer of knowledge.
Yeah, I think for those of you that know my work, you can definitely see where I get my influences on specific things. Because when I run into a problem, say I want to learn how to, solder a guard, I'll find somebody who is really good at soldering a guard, and I will message them and say, "Hey, I've been working on this soldering a guard. It's really difficult. Do you have any tips and tricks on how to do this?" And it's really come that way with specific aspects of knife making. So with Loveless Knives, I was lucky enough to have John as my mentor because he knew Bob, and he knew Wayne Clay. Wayne Clay taught him how to make knives because when John was in Germany in the late '80s, he met Dietmar Kressler at an event, and Bob Loveless was there. He told Bob that he wanted to learn how to make knives, and Bob said, "Hey, if you can get to Tennessee next week, I'll have Wayne Clay teach you how to make knives." And John showed up at Wayne Clay's house, and Wayne Clay taught him how to make knives because Bob Loveless said he would. So I'm very lucky to have that aspect. But then one day I couldn't get hold of John, and I had a question of pin placement behind the guard. How far back do you go? Half inch, 3/4 of an inch, whatever. So I messaged Steve Johnson. Steve Johnson was getting ready to have a family function, and he said, "Give me a phone call." And I said, "Okay." So I called him. He took pictures of his Loveless model with all of the pin placements, sizes, everything on it. Used a ruler, showed me absolutely everything. And since that day, Steve and I have been friends, and he answers any questions that I have about his work or certain things. Before Blade, Texas, I was trying to solder guards, and I absolutely hate using a flame. So I don't like using a torch. It just gets hot too fast. So I messaged Steve, and Steve's like, "Do you have the right solder?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I've got the Eutectics 157B. He's like, are you using a heat gun? And I said, no, I'm not using a heat gun. He's like, go get a heat gun. And I went and got a heat gun, and it worked. Like, so I have Steve Johnson as one of the guys that's really helped me out with understanding a little bit more of the loveless design, some old school techniques like soldering, pin placements. Uh, Another thing would be like guard thickness. A while back, I tried to make a burden trout based off of Steve Johnson's burden trout that he used to make, and my first one was about a half-inch thick at the slotted guard. Well, it looks like a bolster, but it's slotted one piece, and he goes, "That's way too thick." I was like, "Okay." So then the second time I did it, we kind of went over thicknesses a little bit more, and he was like, "I kind of look at it as an eighth, an eighth, and an eighth." And I was like, "Okay, well that kind of makes sense." He was like, "But then you also need to taper it from the back of the back of the bolster to the front, so it needs to be thin." So, I went back and forth with him, sending pictures, and finally got that figured out. Yeah, he's been very, very helpful. I love Steve a lot. Um, he's a great ambassador for knife making. He'll literally help anybody. 2 years ago, I was in Texas for my inspection for probationary member to the Knife Makers Guild, and I met WD Pease, and I was very, very impressed with his work. But my interaction with him was actually prior to that, because I had bought the book on how to make lockback folders by Wayne Clay, Frank Centofonte, and Ron Lake. And I had read the book a couple times, and I got to the back of the book, and it says other people who are making quality lockback folders are blah, 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 WD Peace. And I was like, okay, well, I know that name. So I found him on Facebook, and I asked him if he offered any classes. He said, no, I don't offer any classes, but if you want to come to my shop, I'll teach you how to make lockback folders. I'll show you how I do things. And I was like, that seems like a really good opportunity. So I went down to his house for 4 days, stayed there with him and his wife, and I watched him go through all the steps from pulling out the pre-made spring and blade to drilling all the holes, fitting everything up, making sure that it's not too tight. He literally went through everything, and I got to watch all of that. And it was kind of eye-opening to see his shop, because it's not as sophisticated as I thought it was going to be. He doesn't have. I don't think he has a surface grinder. He's got 2 mills, 4 the flat sanders, disc sanders. He's got 4 disc sanders, but they're set up quite interesting. They are on a really slow motor, and it's got the chain on it. So there's like a shaft in between, and then there's like a disc sander on this side, a disc sander on this side. And they're all set up to a different grit. So I don't remember what the grits were, but arbitrarily one was 200, 400, 600, 800, or whatever. He would, after he did everything, he'd go over and he'd flatten them, clean off the burrs. And he kind of used that as his surface grinder. That's how he, cleaned material down. That's how he made sure things were flat. It was really cool. he had a jig for literally everything. There was something in his process that he did that would cut time for everything. He doesn't. He didn't do. Uh, he's known for doing file work on the back of his blades, and so on the back of the knife and the lock bar. He does not do that by hand. He uses his 2x72 and has like a really small pin that spins, and he uses 2x72 belts or 1x72 belts that he splits at a slow speed, and he'll mark the blade down and then go over there and start it, and then I think I saw him do. They look like hourglasses. He did a whole lockback, the bar and the blade in like an hour. It was impressive. So he also had a one mill specifically set up just to do milling relief on the liners. He would go over there and he'd put the liner down. He'd put a pin in here, and it had like a spring-loaded section that would keep it in place. And then he'd turn the machine on, and then he'd take the blade and he'd spin it. And he knew that machine was always set up to do the mill relief properly because he had done it that way. So he just walked over there, zzz, put the other one on, zzz, done. Perfect. And then he'd go back to the disc sanders, clean up the edges, we'd move on. I saw maybe the most important thing that I learned from him was how to work with stag. I mean, stag is something that's like very deceptive because you never know like how thick it is, where, or what it's going to look like when you do something to it. So you always have to remove material from the back side because you want to keep the nice character on the front side. So I learned how to, taper and remove material from stag when I went to his shop, and I think that was one of the most important things for me because I really like using stag. It's just very difficult to get it perfectly correct. And then I saw how he likes to do decorative bolsters on his lockbacks. So he'll use mosaic Damascus from like Robert Egeling or somebody else, and he would heat it up until it turned colors, and then he'd heat it up, wait for it to change colors, heat it up again for a few seconds, wait for it to change colors, and he would do that until he got the desired color that he wanted, and then he dipped it in, he cooled it off. So that was kind of cool to see. And then I got to see how he used a pantograph to etch all of his blades with his name, and then he puts his model number on all of them, so he knows exactly when he made it. He has a specific like naming system that he uses. So I mean that was really cool just to see him go through the whole thing, and then he was just like, "All right, sending this off in the morning. Customer's going to be happy." And I was like, I would be too. It's a beautiful knife. So that was really cool to see that. When I recently got into more lockback folders, like try and put my own together, I had started to message Rick Genovese because he's probably the one person who makes the interframe lockback folder more so like I want to. And Rick has been extremely helpful with answering every question that I've ever had. And I was very grateful for that as well. And I was incredibly happy to be able to meet him a couple weekends ago in California. So that was really, really cool. I think that's the majority of the people that I've really learned from.
Yeah. Well, so listeners, there's a lot to unpack there with what Craig just said too, because I think that when you're taught on the internet or you're doing research, it's very, it takes a lot of time, right? And when makers tell you that you can cut off years of your learning experience through going and sitting with a maker, it is true, because like what Craig was talking about was in soldering guards and the difference between flame versus heat gun. All right, the in jewelry making, and this is something that I'm okay with using a flame because I learned a really difficult lesson in flame control. And in jewelry making, you're working with precious metals, you're soldering things, you're melting things, and the flame behaves in a way that you have to learn, right? If you're doing an oxygen mixture with flames, or if you're using straight butane or something like that, they all respond a little bit different, and they also have different characteristics for how you use the flame, whether it's the blue cone at the front of the nozzle or the orange tip of the flame. You have to be able to know how hot certain areas get and how quickly they melt things, right? And with a heat gun, the difference is like you take the temperature that's a constant because of the way that the coils work in a heat gun in the air, and that makes a very consistent, homogeneous heat source that you can then control a lot more of how your solder flows, because again, it's consistent. You don't have to worry about that technique for heat or for flame management. And so those are like it's hard to do that. It's hard to work with a flame. So some knife makers will go to a heat gun because it's consistent and it's a little bit lower learning curve. Like I spent years learning proper flame management with jewelry, and you just have to mess up a bunch of gold and silver and platinum until you get it right. And that's just one element. When Craig is talking about a tool for a specific purpose, or jigs, or techniques for Damascus and mokume and other type of finishing or handle materials. All of those are elements that you get a crash course in that when you go to somebody who uses those materials a lot, that you just have to spend a long time trying to understand and work through all the pitfalls. So I highly encourage the transfer of knowledge through makers if they have the time and you have the time, and if you can compensate them somehow in their time that they invest in you, is the best way to learn, because it's a different beast experiencing it and seeing it versus just reading about it technically in a blog or something. It really does increase the amount of time or decreases the amount of time it takes to learn something.
Yeah, I think the most important thing about going to another maker shop is not only do you get to see their process, which could wildly differ from yours, it could also save you a lot of time in your process. But when you're reading in a book, it's hard to understand troubleshooting if something doesn't go exactly the way it's supposed to. When you're in another maker shop, you have that ability to say, hey, what do you do if this doesn't work the way it's supposed to? Like, how do you save this piece? What can I do to fix this? And that is invaluable information.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. So, segueing into the few shows that you mentioned and everything like that. So you got voting member status in the guild early this year, and then you went to Solvang and then to Solingen, right? Can you talk a little bit about your show experience? And mostly, I'm interested in like the reason why you wanted to get into the guild. Although that seems self-explanatory based on what you talk about in knowledge transfer and everything, but then also the difference between United States knife shows and international ones. Like, I think you have a firsthand knowledge on that now, especially since it's so fresh for you.
When it comes to the recent shows that I've been to, um, John has been the one person that's always been there for me. He's always answered all my phone calls, 10 o'clock at night. Hey, John. Um, like most recently, I was using some vintage green canvas micarta, and it was turning brown, and I was only, grinding it at like 80 grit at 20% on my VFD. And it was turning brown, and usually when something turns brown, you're burning it. And I was freaking out because this is like, $60, $100 set of handle material. So I called John and I'm like, hey, what's going on? He asked me what it was. He's like, oh, no. That's just the way vintage green canvas micarta looks after it patinas. So just, kind of things like that. And John has been in the Knife Makers Guild for, 20 plus years. And before that, he was also in the Deutsches Messermacher Guild when he was living in Augsburg, Germany, as a serviceman. So the difference with the American Guild and the German Guild is, from what I've noticed, it's a lot easier for you to learn from another maker in the United States than it is for you to learn from another maker in Germany. In Germany, they expect you to, learn yourself, make those errors, correct everything, and learn your own processes. In America, it's a little different because everybody wants you to come to their shop. Everybody's willing to share information. There's nothing really off limits, knowledge-wise. And I think it's also definitely a lot different now that, in the age of the internet, where you have YouTube and knife forums and Facebook, that knowledge is literally at your fingertips. The best way to filter through that knowledge to understand it the best and act on it the best is to work through that with other makers. And I think that that's where the Knife Makers Guild comes into play, because there are literally some of the greatest knife makers in the world right now in the Knife Makers Guild. And historically, the Knife Makers Guild's shows so back in the day, shows were rare, and the Knife Makers Guild came around so that just members of the guild were in the show, and it was the best knife makers out there. You'd have the people like Buster Warinsky, Warren Osborne, people that knife makers today are still looking at their stuff and saying and finding inspiration from. Bob Loveless, Steve Johnson, all a part of the Knife Makers Guild at some point in their life. So it's kind of moved into less about doing their own show and more about like the fellowship of being around other makers, that they've set a quality standard. And that's what I really wanted to be a part of, was something where there was a standard that had to be met to be a part of this organization. And it's kind of like, what is it? Is it the Good Housekeeping or Better Homes and Gardens or whatever, where they endorse something? It's like it's a way for people who are buying knives to know that this maker makes quality products. This maker is making something that is worthy of being bought. It's a good product. And I wanted to learn. That's the number one thing I want to do, is I want to learn and I want to get better. So I did originally tried to get my signatures in Blade Show West in LA. That's where I met Dennis Friedley for the first time. Absolutely love his work. He's an inspiration. Super nice guy. He signed my paperwork. Tim Robertson signed my paperwork. Luke Swinson signed my paperwork. And since they said that Dennis wasn't in the guild anymore, um, Tobin Hill signed my paperwork. But then when I came back for Blade Show Texas to get my probationary, they got me 3 signatures because I must have forgot my paperwork. But I went through that. Then I had to wait another year. Really worked on specific things that I knew I wanted to work on. So it was mainly guarded knives. So in that time, I spent a lot of time talking to another knife maker from Texas, Paul Lusk. Learned some techniques on how to, make sure that my tapered tangs are perfectly tapered just to the back of the guard slot. And there's an equation that you can use that will automatically give you a pin gauge that will make your taper perfect. So I spent a lot of time learning that in between probationary and the second interaction. So then 2 months ago in March, I went down to Texas and went through my voting memberships inspection. And some people will be incredibly scared going through that. I was incredibly interested to see what they had to say and how I could improve. Luckily, I had one of the most brutally honest guys inspect my stuff, and he was brutally honest and told me things that I knew I needed to work on. But he didn't just tell me that I needed to work on them. He told me, how to fix those things, how to see scratches that maybe your lighting in your space blur out. He told me lots of different things, and I still call him every once in a while. Stanley Buzzick, it was an awesome interaction. I talked to him for a couple hours, and he signed my paperwork for my voting status. So that was a really cool experience. So going into this last year, I had 2 shows planned, and that was Blade Show Texas, the 3rd week of March, and the Knife 2023 in Solingen, Germany. At that point, going into November of last year, John and Eddie Ray were going to go with me to Germany because it would be John's first time back in Germany in, 15, 20 years or something like that. And then John kind of got sick and had to go to the hospital and had a surgery. So then Eddie Ray and John kind of backed out, and it was just me. So I didn't want to leave. And then, a couple months later, they'd been ramping up the Solvang show for, since the summer before. And it had one of the greatest lists of living knife makers out there right now, set to go. And I was like, man, I'd really love to go to that as a person not exhibiting, but just to go see the work, talk to the makers, and have a fun time. And then I was like, but it's literally 4 days before I leave to go to Germany. That's probably not possible. And then mid-January, early February, I get a phone call from Dennis Friedley, and he goes, hey, would you be interested in coming as an exhibitor to our show in Solvang? And I instantly said yes. Yes, it was an opportunity that I could never turn down. Rick Genovese was there. Who else was there? Dietmar Kressler was there. There were several AKI members that were there. Tony Baker was there. Kyle Royer was there. Jim Sornberger was there. The list is it was a ridiculous list, right? And just to be considered as somebody that he felt was making nice enough stuff to invite to a show with mastersmiths and AKI members and people who do this for a professional job was an amazing feeling. But it got a lot better. By better, I mean like when I got out there, it was super busy. The show was great, but there was a lot of time that I got to spend talking to makers about stuff that they do and having them inspect my work. Um, so Dietmar Kressler is one of the makers that I admire the most. His style of loveless blades, but in an integral format, and the way he has special finishing that he does with multiple different types of satin finishes mixed with near polished sections of the blade and the handle, and the way he fits everything is flawless. And the very first day I was in Solvang, I saw Dietmar, who knew John, and I let him know that John sends his best, and that was kind of my end to having a conversation with Dietmar. And we started talking about knives, and he just started, talking about how he makes knives, what the processes are that he uses, like down to the size of the wheel he uses, what size of a belt he uses, what material, like everything. So I spent, maybe a half hour talking to him inside the show. And then he went outside to smoke, and we spent another half hour or so talking outside about how to do stuff. And then he came by my table and inspected my knives, and we had a conversation about, how to improve things, what he did and didn't like. I think that was one of the coolest things that I've ever had happen to me as a knife maker, was somebody that you admire so much coming by your table and giving you honest feedback about your work. I had John Horrigan come by my table and do the same thing. Rick Genovese did the same thing. Tony Baker did the same thing. So I got a lot of honest feedback from them on things that they saw that they thought that I should improve on. So I have a lot to unpack when I get back home on how I'm going to make my future knives, because I had a lot of feedback. So then after that show, I went to Germany, and the way I got into the Deutsche Knifemaker Guild was I had bought 2 books by Stefan Steigerwald. One of them was how to make integrals, which is something that I've always wanted to do. I just haven't had an opportunity to do yet. I've talked to Edmund Davidson about it several times. He's a pretty good friend of mine, and I just haven't got around to doing it. So I bought Stefan Steigerwald's book on integrals. I also bought his book on lockback folders, and I read them. And Stefan was one of the organizers of the show for the Knifemaker Guild. When I first got there, after I set up everything, I looked for him, and he had already came and gone. He'd set up on this table. So the next morning, the morning of the show, it opened at 8 o'clock. The show opened at 10, but the doors were open at 8 to the makers. I went down there to see him, and he said, Are you one of the guys from overseas that was asking me about joining the guild? And I was like, no, I don't think so. But now that you've asked, I'd be more than willing to fill out your paperwork. So I took an application, I filled it out, went upstairs, got my 5 knives. I came back downstairs, and they inspected my knives, and I was given probationary status into the Knifemaker Guild in like 10 minutes. So it was kind of a crazy thing, because I had no intention of joining the guild, but when he asked, I was like, you know what, that's actually not a bad idea. I think I'll just try, because I'm always looking for people to give me feedback on my knives. And they were, impressed. And being a young maker, which can sometimes be difficult, because there's not very many young makers doing it at a level that some of the older guys are. It's just it's an older person's game, I think, the knife making is. a lot of the just young people aren't into it as much at that level. So when I was at both shows, I was, one of the youngest people in the room. So in Solvang, there was, Andrew Mears. He's like 36 or 38. Kyle Royer, myself. Tyler Turner's not much older than us. There was like 4 or 5 of us that are under 40 years old. And then every other table was, 50s, 60s, 70 years. So it's definitely different being a younger maker. But I think that's part of what makes it so special, and especially what makes it special for some of the mentors, that they get to share information with people who are hungry and want to learn. For people who want to learn, the one thing I can say is just ask. Makers want to share information. Don't expect information, but be cordial and just ask questions. Be inquisitive. Like, I would not be anywhere that I am right now. I would never have been invited to Solvang or anywhere if I didn't just start asking questions and try to be the best maker that I could possibly be.
Yeah. Well, kind of on that note, so, I think that's really good for new makers that are just starting out to as an advice point. And kind of like typically what I ask near the end of our interviews is like if there's like a set of things that you could recommend to like new makers or intermediate makers, like those who are trying to come up, what would they be? That's a really good first one. Do you have any other types of advice for newer makers?
Yeah, don't get discouraged. The way I look at things is failure is just another way to learn how not to do something. And the more ways I learn not to make it, I have a better chance of learning how to do it. I think that's most evident. I'm very open about my knife making and my process on my Instagram. So I'll post, what I've done for the day, what my processes are. If anybody has a question about certain things, I'll do a video on it. When I tried to learn how to do fit guards without solder, I think I went through probably 20 different fittings because I didn't like the way one fit. One of them didn't do this. One of them didn't do that. And yeah, it was frustrating, not getting it right. But at the end of that, I had something, I don't want to say it was perfect, but I was proud of it. And I had learned something that was not necessarily the easiest to learn. And through that whole process, not only did I fail a bunch of times, but I called, several other makers and I was like, hey, do you do this process? And then they would say, yeah. And I'm like, how do you do that? And I would go through the points in which I had failed to see what I could do differently. It's just always being, I guess, always wanting more is just kind of who I am. I always want to do more. I want to be better. I always want to be the best that I can. So not accepting less than quality. So one of the things that John taught me very early on was set a standard and always follow that standard. And if you can't make that standard, don't put it out. So there's been several times where, I've screwed up a blade or something and I can't fix it. I don't finish it. When we were in Texas, Matt Collum came by my table and I had a drop point loveless 1-inch guard that I had silver soldered. But I had taken it off my table because I found an issue with the top of the guard was some of the silver solder just wasn't there after finishing. They were pits. And I took it off my table because that's not something that I wanted to sell. I didn't want to sell something that wasn't of good quality. And Matt asked me, he goes, "Oh, wow, cool, you sold one." I go, "No, I didn't sell it. I took it off the table because it didn't meet my standard." So setting that standard is incredibly important. I think for a lot of new makers, I've seen in a lot of groups, you go to YouTube. YouTube always has the answer. My problem with YouTube is the makers who are putting stuff on YouTube are not necessarily the makers that I want to learn from. They're not the Steve Johnsons. They're not the Edmund Davidsons or the Dennis Friedleys. The people who are putting out content that I want to see, that are putting out content that is like the most helpful to makers, they're charging for it. Like Kyle Royer or Jason Knight, and all these other people. Most of the top tier makers are going to charge money for their content. But there are exceptions. So 2 weeks ago in Solvang, I was looking at John Horrigan's stuff, and we got talking about stuff, and I kind of got this idea that I wanted to do, six part Turkish twist Damascus, but I've never made Turkish twist before. On my way home, I sent John a message. I was like, "Hey, do you mind if I call you the Monday after I get back from being out of the country, and we talk about how to make Turkish twist?" And he's like, "Yeah, not a problem. Give me a phone call." It's just finding people who have knowledge that's worthy of being shared, I think, is important. I am very leery of YouTube because anybody can have a YouTube channel. Anybody can share anything they want. But I'm only interested in the correct information. So I'm very leery of YouTube. I usually just go straight to the source. If I see somebody's knife that I really like and something about it that they did really well, and I want to know how they did it, I have no problems just messaging them on Facebook or Instagram and saying, "Hey, my name is such and such. I've been following your work. I noticed on your most recent work that you did such and such. Would you mind talking about how you did that? Because I'm really interested in doing that myself." And I've had pretty good luck with that approach. Other things, another thing that John taught me was having the right tools for the job is incredibly important. So understanding what you need to do in certain situations is incredibly important. I have a little bit of a different shop than most people. Like, I have a giant surface grinder in my garage, and I use it for just about everything. I only know a few other people who have an automatic surface grinder in their knife making shop. It's just pretty rare. And I have a mill, and my biggest thing is, precision and accuracy is what I really care about. So those tools are really important to me. So knowing where you want to go and how, knowing where you want to go and what you want to make is going to determine who you're going to talk to and how you're going to set your shop up. I think that's fairly important.
Yeah. So, kind of on the point of YouTube, I mean, this reality is that anybody can create content. Specifically, I think to frame that for new makers is that sometimes when you're on a journey of acquiring knowledge, you don't know what kind of questions to ask, right? And YouTube and blogs and other things like that can be very useful for being able to qualify certain types of techniques, right? But there's a million different ways to do it, and there are a lot of different ways to ruin it too. And so you get to a picture when somebody's creating content of just the things that might be popular, or the things that might be en vogue for the time. But there's a lot of there's a lot of techniques in knife making that you see on like the finished work from a maker, and you might see it in a picture or whatever, but you don't really get to see how it's done. So for the vast majority of techniques in knife making, there really is no tutorials or things like that for it. And something that I think that Craig and I and a few other makers who understand that this is not very well documented try to actually post up on our social media to give a peek behind that curtain. Because when I was getting into it, even though the internet was a very viable source for qualifying questions and then being able to talk to makers, a large portion of actually how to execute it was either trial and error or talking to somebody to try to lower the error portion, and then still going through trial and error. So if you can get qualified information and it lowers the learning curve of you doing something, that ideally is what you want to do as a new maker. Take less time, ruin less things, and work your way through the process through qualified knowledge. And I think that that's an important piece. So be distrustful or be scrutinizing over the kind of information you're consuming, because it is very easy to learn bad habits in anything, whether it's instruments or other artistic techniques, and knife making especially. And it can be very hard to correct it. And you might actually find that certain issues that you have in your fit and finish might actually be because of the bad technique or bad behavior or poor posture or things like that you're doing early on in your knife process, and that just gets compounded as you go on when you're trying to get to that finished knife.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I get questions about the most is I'm one of the, I don't want to say few makers, but I taper all my tangs, and it's not necessarily one of the most popular things to do because I think a lot of people don't see a return on investment for the time. It takes quite a bit of time. It takes me maybe an hour and a half to taper a tang. But I use the flat platen, and then I also use an automatic surface grinder with a magnetic sine chuck and pin gauges. But after you do that, when you're starting to do your handles, you can't just drill holes straight through the tang, because you change the way that the handle now fits onto the tang. It's now at an angle. So one of the most important things about that I've spent quite a few times on my Instagram talking about is you have to keep the blade perfectly perpendicular to the drilling surface. That is the only way to ensure that you are going to get the best fit on your pins or your Corby bolts, your Loveless bolts, whatever. It is the only way it's going to be completely straight. And you'll have some people say, well, it's not a big deal, just drill straight through and then flip it over and just straight through. It's just not the right way to do it. And I've had a lot of questions about that, and I have a specific jig just for that. It's basically just a giant clamp that holds my blades perpendicular to my milling machine when I drill my holes.
Yeah, so for everybody who didn't pay attention in trigonometry and geometry, there are some actual real-world applications in knife making.
Yeah. I'm not a math person, but I use math now more than I ever did.
It's the same way. Like I'm on this kick of actually being a competent machinist, and in this world of using surface grinders and milling machines and lathes and everything, half 10,000ths matter, and in your fit and finish and everything. Like for instance, when you're doing integral liners for slip joints, for instance, the easiest way to get a really tight fit from your spring to your liners is to surface grind it correctly, right? Otherwise, you have to spend a long time lapping it, and you don't always know whether you're going to get that very tight fit without any gaps. Well, you can solve that problem by using your equipment correctly, but you have to be cognizant of it cognizant of warp. You have to be cognizant of how you're taking off material to your in conjunction with how it's taking it off of with your surface grinder, and all of that compounds. If you don't get it straight and you don't get it flat, or you mistake, just slapping it on a tool and saying, okay, this thing will make it flat. It doesn't really work that way. There's finesse with every machine that you use, and you got to learn not only how your machine operates, but then also how to achieve a result using that tool. And so there is learning curves for precision, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I had that conversation with Rick Genovese last week. So when Rick talks about, Rick also spent like 6 straight years posting every single day work in progress pictures and explaining to people how he makes his automatic folders and his Persian lockbacks and everything. So I use a lot of his pictures as reference points. But Rick, when he uses his pivot, he uses a hardened 440C part, but it is, I think he said, 1,000th wider than the thickness of the blade, so that it gives a 0.5 thousandths on each side of movement.
Is he using like a pivot bushing?
Yeah. So, I mean, a 0.5 thousandths to some people is like a ridiculous tolerance, but for people who are really about details and stuff, it's necessary, and you can attain that. It's not that, I don't think it's that hard, especially with a hardened piece, because if he's using 440C, he could put that on his magnetic chuck on his surface grinder and literally take off 0.1 of a thousandth at a time. But him and I were talking about this last week. Instead of working in 5 and 10ths of a thousandth, 5 thousandths and 10 thousandths, we work in like 0.1 of a thousandth, which is a lot different than most of the industry. At least most of the industry when it comes to handmade knives. There's a lot of good enough, or that looks right, or it's okay. It might be a little big, but if you really want to set yourself apart, it's doing something to the best that you can. Good enough is not something that I have in my vocabulary in my garage. If it's not up to what I think it should be, it just doesn't get completed. It gets chucked.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important too to know, like, there are stages to knife making, right? And
definitely.
You can take like a fixed blade is probably some of the most forgiving when it comes to tolerances, and you can take a fixed blade that has no bolsters or really complex geometries and no embellishments that highlight those things, and you can do it with a fairly wide tolerance. So as long as your handle material is flat, as long as your blade is relatively flat, you can get there to a tolerance that works, and your eye does not catch it. But as you start adding things like bolsters, right, they have to be flat to the ricasso and everything. If you're going to slot them, all the geometry has to be right. You can't have gaps or things, otherwise your eye's drawn to it. If you do dovetailing, it gives you a geometrical reference point to it. If you're doing tapered tangs, it compounds that even further. Like, all of these things, when you start getting into like the high technical details of knives, it forces you to shift that paradigm to high tolerance, because otherwise everything that you do is your eye is drawn to it. So you have bolsters that are not lined up correctly. Well, it's gonna just look not right. If your pinholes for pins, or if you're using Corby fasteners, if they're not set just right, it's going to look off. Those type of things. When you get to a certain stage of embellishment and technical finesse with knives, that's where precision becomes necessary. But if you're just doing knife making as you're putting scales on it without any bolsters and things like that, there are ways that you can get around of like really tight, half thousandths or 0.1 tolerances. So it's not to say that at this stage that like Craig and I operate at, or other knife makers that like high precision, is the end all be all. But if you want to get like this really tight look and everything has its place, then you have to resign yourself to the fact that precision is part of how you get there.
Yeah, it's all about like the things that I've noticed that, especially in other people's works, that really draw your eye and make you say, "Wow, that person knows what they're talking about." Precision and symmetry. Those are the two things. And if you can do well at symmetry, that is a large portion of making something look good. Being symmetrical is very difficult, and especially with muscle memory, right? So I'm right-handed, and I can do basically, I'm a wizard with my right hand, but I can't do everything with my right hand that my left hand can do. So I have to constantly work on being able to match what I do with my right hand with my left hand. Or sometimes I'll start with my left hand because I know I can match it with my right. It's little things like understanding that I learned from another maker. He's like, well, I know you're comfortable with your right hand. You probably do all your grinding first on your right side. Well, it'd be the left side, but you with your right hand. But maybe you should start with your left hand and do the right side first, so then you can know that you can match it to the other side. Learning those muscle memories and constantly challenging yourself, I think, is also very, very important.
Yeah, yeah, because knife making is whole body, right? I mean, it is. There's ways that you can get around handicaps like not being able to stand or not having all of your fingers or things like that, but it is something that's a deficit where if you can learn to work with your whole body, you use your whole body to grind things and to lay out work and things like that, then you'll be a lot more proficient at it. And that's kind of the point on symmetry, right?
Yeah.
Symmetry is a very simple process of being able to lay out your work and be able to grind to a line or a layout line, right? I mean, there's obviously nuances to that, but you solve a lot of symmetrical problems by being able to lay out or scribe your work using a reference point like a straight edge or a surface plate or things like that. So there are ways to hack the system, as it were, or to make it easier for you to get to where you need to on your grinder when you're doing freehand, but it also requires laying out things and making sure that you are measuring things correctly, and then give yourself some reference points so that way you can grind to them.
Yeah, so an interesting thing about symmetry with it, if you ever look at a Ron Lake knife, the front end is perfectly tapered and each side matches perfectly. The reason why that is because it's not done by hand. I mean, it is done by hand, but it's not done on a grinder. He created his own jig that was like a vertical piece that he straps the side of the handle on for the lockback, and then it spins on a rotating table, and the cutter will only cut what it's supposed to cut. So you put up the left side and you spin it, and it'll perfectly cut, an inch or so of that. And then he puts the right side on and does the same thing. So his fronts will always match. And then he uses, well, he doesn't make knives anymore, I don't think. I think he's retired. But when he did, he'll then use the slack belt to blend the middle section of the blade of the handle into the front that has been perfectly machined. So it's kind of stuff like that where if you know you're going to have a problem doing something, do you have a better process for it?
Yeah. And just remember, like in all spectrums of knife making, I've seen some incredible work that's been done with files and sandpaper.
Oh my gosh.
I've also seen some incredible work that's done by milling machines and CNC. And so where you're at in your journey as a knife maker, and where it makes sense in your head, especially with the tools that you have, you got to find that middle ground and be able to use the tools to their maximum capacity. And I mean, if you're innovative and you think through the problem, I guarantee you can solve it. But it just sometimes takes a little bit of thinking outside of the box to make sure that like the problem that faces you is the one that you solve, and how you solve that makes you the kind of knife maker that Craig and I specifically try to endear ourselves to, because they've figured out all these different methods for coming up with ways to make things easier and more predictable, and the process more exact. And I think that's something that I really appreciate about some of these old guys.
Yeah, I think for me, one thing that I would tell newer makers is the machine is not the end all be all, like you just said, right? Um, I learned to try to do everything on the machine, but when you try to do everything on the machine, your your chance of screwing something up is incredibly high. For example, 2 months ago, I was at Aaron's house sharpening knives, and I had a beautiful Loveless style lamb handled skinner that had, I mean, it was put together really well, and it had a very, very expensive amber stag with domed pins on it. And I start out the blade grinder on, like, I don't know, was it 30 or something, 30 or 40 speed. And I said, I'm like, I'm gonna sharpen this knife. And then Aaron goes, "Are you sure that speed's okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." Like 2 seconds later, he hears me screaming obscenities in the garage. And he comes out and he's like, "You screwed it up, didn't you?" I'm like, "Yeah, yeah." So that was one conversation I had with Stanley, was what's the best way to sharpen a knife? Because there's nothing more annoying than getting down to the very end after you've done everything to the best of your ability and screwing up the sharpening and completely ruining a knife.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And, it's kind of on that note, in that experience. So one, you're in a knife maker shop that you've never had experience with, right? You're using tools that are not your tools, and it's down to the wire, and it's right before a show, and it's like the pinnacle of stress, right? And there's a certain amount of that where you're like, hey, like I'm a good knife maker, like this, like we're peers, and I'm going to go into this knife shop, and I'm expected to perform a certain way, and I don't know if I would have used like some hand files and just like took the lick and done it outside of the purview of anybody else before I went into some other person's shop and had to deal with that peer pressure. So I apologize if that was there, but
no,
kind of
it was fine.
Kind of on that note, it's like. That's one thing that, like, sharpening blades is something that I think my voting status blades with the guild I brought in, and I was using a Tormach. Now everything that you hear about Tormach sharpeners is that you put it on there, it's super expensive, so it's nice to use and everything like that. And I had the experience where it was gouging these tapers and everything I was putting at the end of my my blade. So like I was doing swooping grinds and everything, and if you look down at with your blade faced up, it has this nice long triangular taper to it. And when I was sharpening on the Tormach, it was eating through that and creating a ridge. And so the sharpening edge itself was what they called crude, right? They're like, well, it's a good working edge. I think one of the Matthews said that, and I was like, that's not what I wanted to hear. It's like, it's a good working edge. And so I was like, man, there's got to be a better way. So because I chose to do those swooping grinds and everything, I also had to learn how to taper my bevels, right? And the best way that I found to do that is to slack belt the tapers on the grinder. So using just the very front edge of the contact wheel on like a flat platen, but where it's very rigid, so that way I can control the swoop, right? And then get it to a place where the like when you're initially setting the edge, it just creates a burr, but then after that, I do everything by hand in sharpening it. So whether it's a whetstone or whether you're using wicked edge or whatever, then you finesse the rest of that hair whittling edge after the fact. So if I can go slower, it allows me to control it. And if I've already set that swooping edge on the when I'm setting the bevel, the sharpening bevel, to me it was just easier to do the stuff that requires a lot of decent amount of stock removal for the edge bevel on the grinder, and then finesse that through the sharpening process where I can go slower and kind of like I can evaluate how much material I need to take off to get it to its final dimension.
Yeah, I think with the last knives that I had to do for soling, and then the ones I also took the soling in, I had my grinder literally like moving 0.2 miles an hour or something. It was so slow, but I knew at that point that I could not. I literally could not screw up. Like looking away for a second or not paying attention was not going to be a devastating issue for me. So it took a little longer to do, but from a quality standpoint, it was a much better sharpening job than I did before.
Yeah. No, and that's just chalk it up to learning experience, and that's like a lot of people don't think of the edge. Like people want sharp knives, right? But they don't think of the edge bevel or how you get there as being like the another portion of knife making, where it's like that really is like part of the last 10%. Is sometimes getting everything finessed on your knife and the finish and fit and everything looking exactly right is part of 10%, and then you can spend another several hours sharpening it the way that you want to make sure everything is tied together. And it's just another component of knife making that you have to trial and error through it, and not everybody's process is the same, because sharpening is really a component of how your bevels are set up. And how you have to put that sharpening bevel on. So I mean, I fully agree. It's just it's always something, but that's the one thing I really like about knives is it always hits these points of like I'm always learning something, and I'm always learning to appreciate some aspect of it. It's very philosophical.
Yeah, I think that it's another thing when you finally think you understand something, it humbles you really quickly. Like that's the point where you can screw up, and it really humbles you, and you're just like, it keeps you on your toes. It really does. Knife making keeps you honest, man. It just when you're like, man, I understand this. I'm never gonna have a problem with this ever again. Boom, you screw it up, and you're like, all right, I'm human. I need to pay a bit more attention. I need to be a little bit more careful. I need to, it's always teaching you something.
Oh yeah. Yeah, just remember, always trim your mill.
Always trim your mill.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many times I've made mistakes that are the result of not square holes, and a tramming tool is definitely a benefit. There's obviously ways to fix it, like you can oversize your holes and things like that and finesse it, but it requires a lot of finesse, and finesse takes time. You got to remember how to fix screw ups that proper tool setup should fix.
Yeah, the bad part about not trimming your mill is you don't find out that you screwed up until you go to put a handle on.
Yeah.
And then you've spent all that time, and if you did a guard, you spent all that time doing a guard. You like with me, one of them I forgot. I literally just got a mill, and I was like, I'm just going to use it as a drill press for now until I learn how to do this, because I'm not a machinist. So I had tapered my tang, did a guard, did all the bevels, and I'm starting to get to put the handle together, and I keep seeing like a 5 to 10 thousandth gap between the end of the handle material and the back of the guard, and I'm like, I don't know what that is. It was the fact that I didn't tram my mill. It was only on one side too, so one side fit properly. The other side did not. It was off because of the holes.
Yeah, bolsters cause that problem too. I mean, slotting guards and fitting guards is like part of it, but like bolsters, if you want a tight fit, you need to make it like so that the bolsters look like they're integrals, basically. If you really want to do a good job on bolsters. And I had surface ground on my 416 material. I had gotten it perfectly parallel and everything, and the pins were in there. I put just a slight chamfer on the hole so that way I could hide them real easy. And then I have a pin press, so I jack the pins down and everything. And because the holes were not square, it shifted my bolster. And so by the time I had all this, putting tons of pressure on it and everything, and it shifts it. And when I'm starting to do dry fit up for my handle material, I'm noticing that there's like a thousandths, maybe even a half thousandths difference, but it just like my eye is drawn to it. And because I make daintier small knives a lot, I just like, it's the first thing I see. I'm like, I'm going to have to grind that entire thing off, and I'm going to have to push those pins out. And then I'm going to have to go through the process of totally finishing out bolsters again, just to like correct this mistake. And sure enough, it was because it wasn't trimmed properly, and it was drilling, not square holes. So I don't know. It's one of those things. Like if you're thinking about the fact that you buy a drill press or something and it's supposed to be square, make sure that you check it, because there's lots of ways to fix tramming issues. But when it happens, you don't notice it until it's too late, and then you got to do everything all over again.
I have a level in my shop that I use for almost every one of my machines. Not necessarily like the most accurate, but especially when I'm on the grinder and I have my tool rest. If I want my tool rest to be perfectly 90 degrees, I'll use my level and I'll put it on the side and I'll set it up right. I use that level a lot at my grinder, not necessarily at my mill, but I use that. And then I think the other couple tools that I use the most are a surface plate and a nice set of calipers, and then also a nice set of micrometers.
Yep.
So I'll use the micrometers for gauging how thick my cutting edge is, because it's a little easier to use. And then, I'll use my calipers for almost every other measurement that I need to take.
Yep. Yeah, the other thing too is if you want to save good calipers, get a height gauge. Because I do that all the time, where I'm using my calipers as a scribe, and it would just it solves a lot of problems when I just put it on my height gauge instead of being lazy. So, yeah, like a square, things that are square are a little bit easier to gauge geometry on. So I'll either use a machinist square or a 1-2-3 block, because they're square, and things like that. So I mean, yeah, there's inexpensive ways. You don't have to have like a $300 Mitutoyo micrometer or anything. But
no, I think my micrometer is like $50 off of Amazon, but my calipers are like, I don't know, 150. I mean, it's not super expensive, but
yeah.
I mean, I like having a nice set of calipers, and I prefer dial calipers to and digital calipers.
Yeah,
I think it's a little easier to see.
Yeah, I mean, like on rise and fall for slip joints, I'll use a dial because digital is a little bit more of a pain to me, and I can see how much it's rising and falling and everything. I do have digital calipers for, like, I have a Mitutoyo set of calipers and micrometer, but those only get used for when I'm actually trying to measure precision things, and otherwise I use a cheaper set to do other operations like scribe things and whatnot. So, I mean, you can have the nice equipment, just don't abuse it, because it only holds tolerance for so long.
Yeah, I broke my old set of calipers and I was quite upset about it, but I also abused them because I was not treating them properly.
Yeah,
so
you gotta treat your tools right, bro.
I know. Now that I'm paying for my own tools, I treat them properly.
Yeah, it's kind of like you don't punch the wall in your own house, because now you're the adult that has to fix it. It's not your parents anymore, right?
Exactly.
All right, buddy. Well, I'm going to let you get back to it. I know that you're trying to enjoy your vacation in Italy, so I appreciate you spending time with us and sharing your knowledge and your experience and everything. And I hope to have you on again sometime.
Yeah, I'm super excited because on Thursday I'm heading to Bolzano because when I was in Solingen, Reinhard Tschager had a book that was like the last 40 years of his knife making, and it had color photos and everything. And I really wanted that book. But I don't carry cash on me, and he didn't take card. So it was 60 euros for the book. So then we're taking a trip to the Dolomites on Thursday, and I come to find out he lives in the Dolomites. And I messaged him and I was like, "Hey, do you mind if I come by Bolzano and buy one of your books?" And he's like, "Yeah, here's my phone number. Give me a phone call. I'll meet you in town." So I'm really excited about seeing him and getting his book. That's one of the highlights of my trip.
Yeah. If you're in the area and you find some Italian switchblades, pick them up for me and I'll pay you for them.
Normally you'll find those in, what is it, Sicily? They're pretty famous for it down there.
Yeah. Hey.
So yeah, I'll look.
Yeah. If you find something, let me know and I'll get you for it.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem.
All right, bud. Well, you have fun. I really appreciate you again being on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really like talking knives.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved and God bless.